The Blackwood Global boardroom was so quiet that even the rhythmic tick of the antique grandfather clock felt loud. Rows of polished obsidian granite reflected the financial tension hanging in the air. Standing at the center of it all was Jeffrey Blackwood, sharp-featured, disciplined, impeccably dressed like the groom in the image, and very clearly furious. "You cannot force me into this," he said, his tone flat enough to cut glass across the table. His corporate counsel folded his hands calmly. "It is not force, Jeffrey. It is responsibility. If you want to maintain control of Blackwood Global, this marriage is the only way to secure the capital needed. You know that." Jeffrey's fingers curled at his sides. The empire he had built was being leveraged against him over marriage, an arranged one to a woman he had never even met. If he refused, his cousin, Harold Blackwood, would seize control. He would lose everything. He exhaled slowly. "What are the terms?" he asked. The lawyer cleared his throat. "5 conditions, Mr. Blackwood. Both parties must appear together as spouses. No interference in each other's lives. The marriage lasts 1 year, and the true purpose remains confidential." Exactly what he expected. A marriage built on walls. Jeffrey nodded, resigned. He picked up the heavy gold pen. He had been betrayed by love once and now believed it dangerous. He pressed the pen to paper, signing away his personal freedom. Only when he finished did the lawyer add one more detail. "The bride will remain private until the ceremony. It is a request from her family." "I do not get to meet her?" "No, sir, not until the wedding day." A slow, cold breath escaped him. Perfect. A marriage built on anonymity. He closed the dossier, sealing his fate. Deep beneath the hardened layers he had built, a whisper lodged in his heart, and he had no idea that the moment designed to be cold and emotionless, the moment Rose Garrett's face was revealed, would shatter everything he thought he knew about fate. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Jeffrey sat alone in his penthouse office on the 47th floor of Blackwood Tower, staring out at the city lights below. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, a glittering kingdom he had fought tooth and nail to control. Every building, every street, every flickering light represented a piece of the empire his grandfather had started and his father had expanded. And now it all rested on his shoulders. But tonight, despite the power humming beneath his fingertips, it felt less like a kingdom and more like a cage closing in around him. He poured himself a scotch, the amber liquid catching the dim light from his desk lamp, and let the burn settle in his throat. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling window, a man who looked composed, controlled, untouchable. But inside, old wounds ached with a persistence he had learned to ignore, but never truly conquered. His mind drifted back to 7 years ago, to Victoria Langford. She had been everything he thought he wanted: beautiful, intelligent, charming in all the right ways. She had promised him forever, whispered it against his skin in the quiet hours of the night. But forever lasted exactly as long as it took for her to sell confidential Blackwood documents to a competitor for a multi-million-dollar payout. The betrayal hadn't just cost him money or business advantage. It had cost him something far more valuable: the ability to believe in love. He had spent months rebuilding what she had destroyed, both in the company and in himself. And when the dust settled, he had made a vow. Never again would he allow emotion to cloud his judgment. Never again would he mistake passion for partnership. Since then, every relationship had been a transaction, carefully measured and controlled, every emotion locked behind steel walls. And now, here he was, signing a contract for a marriage that would be the coldest transaction of all. He drained the glass and set it down with a sharp click. The bride, whoever she was would remain a stranger. That was safer, predictable, exactly what he needed. There would be no risk of betrayal if there was never any trust to begin with. The Blackwood estate was a fortress of old money, with marble columns that stretched 2 stories high and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. As the wedding day approached, the estate buzzed with a level of activity Jeffrey found exhausting. Florists arranged elaborate displays of white roses and orchids. Caterers tested menu items in the industrial kitchen. Event planners barked orders into headsets, coordinating every detail down to the second. Jeffrey watched it all from the second-floor balcony, detached, as if observing a play he had no role in. He had given his assistant carte blanche to handle the arrangements. He didn't care about flowers or music or seating charts. All he cared about was getting through the ceremony, signing the final documents, and moving forward with the merger that would secure Blackwood Global's future. But then he heard something that made him pause. 2 staff members were whispering near the grand stairwell below. "The bride is terrified," the housekeeper said, her tone filled with sympathy. "She barely touched her breakfast this morning, and I heard her on the phone asking someone if there was any way she could leave." The coordinator shook her head. "Poor thing. Apparently her family is in serious trouble, financial trouble. I overheard Mr. Caldwell saying this marriage is the only thing keeping them from losing everything. She didn't want this any more than Mr. Blackwood did." Jeffrey's jaw tightened. He gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles going white. He hadn't considered that the woman on the other side of this contract might be suffering too. He had assumed she was calculated, willing, maybe even eager to trade her freedom for access to the Blackwood fortune. But the tremor of genuine concern in the housekeeper's voice suggested something entirely different. This wasn't a gold digger. This was someone trapped. For the first time, a flicker of curiosity pierced through his cold resolve. Who was she? What circumstances had forced her into this arrangement? And why did the idea of her suffering bother him more than he wanted to admit? The next morning, Jeffrey was walking through the estate's east wing, headed to a meeting with his financial advisors, when he nearly collided with someone. A woman in a pale ivory preparation dress stumbled backward, clearly startled. Her hands flew up instinctively to steady herself, and for a brief moment their eyes almost met. But she looked away immediately, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then she was gone, hurrying past him down the hallway, her footsteps quick and uneven, like someone fleeing a threat. Jeffrey stood frozen, staring after her. He hadn't seen her face clearly, but he had seen enough. The way her hands trembled even as she tried to steady herself. The way she clutched the fabric of her dress like it was armor, something to hide behind. The way she moved through the space like someone bracing for impact, expecting pain at any moment. He recognized fear when he saw it. He had seen it in boardrooms, in hostile takeovers, in the eyes of competitors who knew they were about to lose everything. But this was different. This was personal fear, raw and unguarded. He forced himself to keep walking, but his mind kept circling back to that brief encounter. It didn't matter, he told himself. In 2 days, this would all be over. The ceremony would be completed, the contract signed, the investors satisfied. They would go their separate ways, living in different wings of the estate if necessary, maintaining the appearance of marriage without the substance. Strangers, bound by paper, and nothing more. But even as he told himself this, he couldn't shake the image of her trembling hands, or the quiet desperation in that single whispered apology. The morning of the wedding arrived with cold gray skies that threatened rain. Jeffrey stood in the estate's grand dressing room, adjusting his cufflinks for the third time. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who looked perfectly composed, every detail of his tailored tuxedo immaculate. But inside, he felt a restlessness he couldn't name. He hated ceremonies, hated the performance, the false intimacy, the eyes of strangers watching his every move. But this ceremony felt different, heavier, like standing on the edge of something he couldn't see. As he waited for the signal that it was time to take his place at the altar, he overheard two assistants speaking in hushed tones just outside the door. "She almost fainted this morning," one said, genuine worry coloring her words. They had to give her water and make her sit down for 20 minutes. She kept saying she couldn't do it, that she couldn't go through with it. The other assistant's voice dropped even lower. "Her brother is outside right now. He looks absolutely devastated. I think this marriage is literally the only thing keeping their family from complete ruin. If she backs out, they lose everything." Jeffrey felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the armor he had spent years building. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't two parties entering a mutually beneficial arrangement with clear eyes and calculated risk. This was desperation on both sides. Two people being forced into a union neither wanted, both sacrificing something fundamental for the sake of survival. And suddenly, the woman he had dismissed as a faceless name in a contract became achingly, uncomfortably real. She was trapped, just like him, maybe even more so. At least he still had some measure of power, some control over his circumstances. But her? She was drowning, and this marriage was the only lifeline anyone had thrown her. The realization unsettled him far more than he wanted to admit. If you can't stand people who use others' desperation for their own gain, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type "nobody deserves that," because what happened next only got worse. The ceremony began in near silence. The grand hall, with its vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers, was filled with investors in expensive suits, distant Blackwood relatives, and the cold, calculating gaze of Harold Blackwood, who sat in the front row with a smile that made Jeffrey's blood run cold. Harold had been waiting for this moment, waiting for any sign of weakness he could exploit. And if this marriage failed, if the merger fell through, Harold would have exactly the opening he needed to challenge Jeffrey's position as CEO. Jeffrey stood at the altar, his posture rigid, his face carefully blank. He had learned long ago how to hide what he felt, how to present a mask of control even when everything inside him was chaos. The officiant stood beside him, holding the ceremonial documents. Classical music swelled from the string quartet, and the massive oak doors at the far end of the hall slowly opened. The bride entered, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. She was heavily veiled, the delicate lace obscuring her face completely. Her white gown was elegant but simple. She was escorted by a young man who Jeffrey assumed was her brother. The brother's face was tight with emotion, his jaw clenched as if physically restraining himself from stopping this entire charade. Her steps were slow, deliberate, measured. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles had gone white. And even from a distance, even through the veil, Jeffrey could see the slight tremble in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone walking to an execution rather than a wedding. As she approached, step by agonizing step, The air in the room seemed to thicken. The music faded into background noise. All Jeffrey could focus on was the woman walking toward him. His heart, which had been locked behind steel walls for 7 years, began to pound, hard, irregular, alive in a way that terrified him. She reached the altar. Her brother released her arm reluctantly, stepping back with visible pain etched across his face. The officiant began to speak, but Jeffrey barely heard the words. All he could focus on was the veil. The moment stretched impossibly long. And then, slowly, with hands that visibly shook, she lifted it. The lace fell back, revealing her face, and Jeffrey's entire world stopped. The breath left his lungs. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, because the face staring back at him wasn't that of a stranger. It was Rose Garrett, the woman who had saved his life 7 years ago. It had been late one night after a corporate event. Jeffrey had been driving back, his mind occupied with merger details. He hadn't seen the other car until it was too late. A drunk driver had blown through a red light, slamming into his vehicle with enough force to send him careening off the road. His car had flipped and come to rest upside down in a ditch. He had been pinned inside, bleeding from a gash on his head, his ribs screaming with pain, disoriented and struggling to stay conscious. And then she had appeared, Rose. She had been walking home from her job at a nearby diner. She had seen the accident and run toward it without hesitation. She had pulled open the damaged door with impossible strength. She had crawled into the wreckage, held pressure on the wound on his head with her bare hands, called for help, and refused to leave until the paramedics arrived. If you believe loyalty and sacrifice matter more than money, hit that subscribe button. People like Harold won't, and you need to hear what she did about it. He had drifted in and out of consciousness, but he remembered her face, the determination in her eyes, the way she kept talking to him, keeping him awake, telling him to hold on. He had tried to thank her at the hospital, tried to find her, but she had disappeared. The paramedics said she had left as soon as they took over, refusing to give her name. And now, here she was, his bride. The staggering secret wasn't just that they knew each other, it was that she had seen him at his most vulnerable, had saved him when he was powerless, and he had never forgotten her face. Not once in 7 years. Rose's eyes met his, wide and filled with recognition. For a moment, neither of them moved. The officiant paused, sensing something was wrong. The guests shifted uncomfortably. And then Rose whispered, so softly that only Jeffrey could hear, "You remember?" Jeffrey's voice came out rough, raw with emotion he couldn't control. "How could I forget?" His hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching for hers. When their fingers touched, he felt a jolt run through him, something electric and undeniable. This wasn't a stranger. This was the woman who had saved him, the woman he had searched for, the woman who had disappeared like a ghost. Before either of them could say more, Harold Blackwood stood abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. His voice, smooth and mocking, carried through the hall. "This is absurd. I think we all deserve some clarity here. Who is this woman really? What is her background? The Blackwood name has standards, and we deserve transparency." The guests erupted in whispers. Investors exchanged meaningful glances. Rose's face went pale, her hand trembling in Jeffrey's. He felt her trying to pull away, but he tightened his grip. Something fierce and protective flared to life inside him, an instinct he hadn't felt in years. He turned to Harold, and when he spoke, his voice was cold enough to freeze steel. "Her background is none of your concern, Harold. And if you question her integrity again, if you speak about her with anything less than respect, you will find yourself removed from this company permanently. And that's not a threat, it's a promise. The room fell dead silent. Harold's smug expression faltered. Jeffrey stepped closer to Rose, positioning himself between her and Harold's hostile gaze, a silent declaration of protection that everyone in the room understood. Rose looked up at him, stunned. For the first time in 7 years, Jeffrey felt something other than cold, calculated control. He felt purpose, he felt certainty, and he felt the beginning of genuine care. The reception was supposed to be quiet and formal. Champagne and polite conversation, a few photographs, and then everyone would go home satisfied. But chaos erupted when the reception hall doors burst open with a bang. A young man stumbled in, disheveled and desperate, his eyes wild with emotion. "Rose, please," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You don't have to do this." Rose's face went completely white. She took a step forward. "Jonas, stop, please, just stop." But Jonas Garrett wasn't stopping. He turned to face the crowd, his voice rising with desperation. "She didn't want this marriage. None of you understand. She agreed to it because our father died and left us buried in debt we didn't even know existed. Medical bills, business loans, gambling debts, everything. We were going to lose our home. We were going to lose everything. She's sacrificing everything, her freedom, her future, her chance at happiness, and none of you even care." The room exploded. Whispers turned to open conversation. Investors stood, shock and concern evident on their faces. Harold leaned back with a satisfied smile, clearly preparing to use this information as ammunition. This was exactly the kind of scandal he had been waiting for. But Jeffrey didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Enough." The single word carried such authority that the entire room fell silent. Jeffrey walked to the center of the space, commanding every eye. When he spoke, his voice was steady, powerful, absolutely certain. "Rose Garrett entered this marriage under the same terms I did, with full knowledge, with integrity, with a sense of responsibility that most people in this room couldn't begin to understand. Her willingness to sacrifice her own happiness for her family's welfare is not a weakness. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's the kind of loyalty, the kind of honor that this company was built on, that my grandfather built Blackwood Global on." He turned to face Harold directly. "If anyone here believes that desperation disqualifies honor, that suffering makes someone less worthy, then you have fundamentally misunderstood what this family stands for, and you have no place in Blackwood Global." Harold's smile disappeared. Several investors nodded slowly. Jeffrey extended his hand to Rose, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was firm. "My wife entered this arrangement to protect the people she loves. I entered it to protect the legacy I've built. We both made sacrifices, and anyone who has a problem with that can leave now." No one moved. No one spoke. And in that moment, Jeffrey realized something profound. He had chosen her, not for the contract, not for the merger, because she deserved to be defended, because she had saved him once, and now it was his turn to save her. Comment "loyalty over greed" if you're Team Rose. The manipulation can't win. Now watch what happens when he finally fights back. Later that night, After the guests had finally left and the estate had fallen quiet, Jeffrey and Rose stood alone in the library. It was a massive room, lined with leather-bound books, with a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. The chaos of the day had faded, leaving only the two of them and the truth hanging in the air. Jeffrey spoke first. "I never forgot what you did for me that night. After I recovered, I looked for you everywhere. I hired investigators, went back to that street corner, asked at every hospital and diner in the area, but you were gone." Rose's voice was soft. "I didn't think you'd remember. It was dark. You were hurt. I was just someone who happened to be there." "You weren't just someone," Jeffrey said, intensity in his voice. "I remembered your face. I remembered the way you stayed when you could have walked away. You saved my life, Rose, and then you disappeared like you thought it didn't matter." Her eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't stay. I had my own problems, my own family to take care of, and I thought maybe it was better if you didn't know who I was. You were this powerful billionaire, and I was just a waitress trying to survive." Jeffrey moved closer. "Is that what you think? That I would have seen you as someone looking for a handout?" She looked down at their joined hands. "I didn't want to find out, and then my father died, and the debts came, and Jonas was going to lose his scholarship, and I didn't know what to do. When your lawyers approached me, I thought it was cosmic irony. The man I saved was the man I had to marry to save my family." Jeffrey's grip tightened. "The contract is broken, Rose." Her head snapped up, fear flooding her eyes. "What? No, you can't. The merger, your company." "I don't care about the merger. Not if it means treating you like a transaction. This isn't a business arrangement anymore." She searched his face. "Then what is it?" He exhaled slowly, the walls he had built for 7 years finally crumbling. "It's a partnership, built on the one thing I thought I'd never find again: trust. You saved me once without expecting anything in return. You saw me at my weakest and you didn't exploit it. You just helped. And tonight, when your brother exposed everything, you stayed. You faced that room with more courage than most people will ever have." Rose's breath hitched. A tear slipped down her cheek. "Jeffrey," he continued, "I know what it's like to be betrayed. I built my entire life around never letting that happen again. But you're different. You've always been different. And if you'll let me, I want to try. Not because of a contract, but because when I saw your face today, everything made sense for the first time in 7 years." She was crying openly now, but she was also smiling. "I didn't think you were capable of feeling, of caring." He touched her face gently, wiping away a tear. "Neither did I, but apparently you have a habit of saving me, even from myself." She laughed, a small sound that held more hope than despair. And in that moment, standing in the quiet library with fireplate dancing across their faces, Jeffrey felt something he hadn't felt since before Victoria's betrayal. He felt whole. The marriage of convenience had ended, and something far more dangerous, far more real, far more beautiful than either of them had expected had begun. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country.